Ladies and gentlemen, please take back your seats. We are about to start the last session of the program. And this will be exactly 1 hour because there's a follow-up meeting with those who are involved with the COP29 Advisory Committee. That comes after this session. So we will finish at 3:30 precisely. It's 2:30 now. We will start. And this session is devoted to the issues of health. And we will have a number of speakers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4 speakers, and of course, a special address by Winnie Byanyima, who is the Executive Director of UNAIDS. Generally speaking, we have just gone through a pandemic, the most serious one in over a century. In fact, now that we look ex post at it, we discover that the number of people who died was about 4 times the official figure of 7 million people. It's closer to 28 million people based on methodological statistical analysis and at a very high 95% confidence level. And that just shows us how serious that issue is. Secondly, it also shows that when you deal with age-adjusted groups, you find that indeed the poorest countries suffered most, and that's not surprising because of the weak public health system in many of these countries. And hence, if we are talking about public health for all, we must talk also about strengthening the local health systems in the poor countries and at the community level. Now, this is not the first pandemic. We've had other pandemics, and we're very proud to have Winnie Byanyima with us, who is heading the UNAIDS, where I remember in the 1980s, AIDS was a death sentence. Luckily now it can be managed somehow, but it's still a very serious issue, and it's been quite a fight, and we're very proud to have you with us. Winnie, the floor is yours. Please, in about 8 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency, Mr. Serageldin, Excellencies at this meeting. I'm really pleased to be here, and thank you for inviting me. Today, I am, yes, the leader of the global HIV response for the United Nations. And this afternoon, I'm grateful to be speaking after a great leader, Prime Minister Gordon Brown, because I will be sharing lessons from the AIDS response and showcasing it as a story of multilateralism at its best, and showing that we need multilateralism. We have used it before, and it has delivered for us. I remember what it was like, yes, in the early 2000s. I'm born in Uganda, and that's where I was at the height of the AIDS crisis, when so many of us saw friends and family withering and dying of an illness for which there were no treatments. In fact, there were treatments in Europe, in America, but they were not affordable to countries in the global south. Then, in 2001, that was a seminal moment. The United Nations brought together governments, scientists, people living with HIV, civil society, communities, the private sector, and created a framework to address a common challenge built on solidarity and trust. That 2001 meeting laid the foundations of how the world responds to health threats. And the world has gathered together at the UN every 5 years since that time, committing to end AIDS through a series of political declarations at the General Assembly, including setting targets every 5 years. The HIV response became a pioneering example of multi-sectoral collaboration, where you have the whole of society and the whole of government working with communities, with people living with HIV, and making decisions together to take the response forward. It's an approach based on understanding that HIV is not just a health problem, but it's driven by social factors like gender inequalities, income inequalities, lack of access to health care, lack of access, unequal access to health technologies, and denial of human rights. A global movement of activists worked to pressure pharmaceutical companies to lower prices and share their technologies. Indian generics slashed the annual cost of HIV treatments. Global programs harnessed resources from richer governments able to pay for medicines. And together, the world turned the tide against AIDS. So, I assert the AIDS response is a success story of multilateralism and partnership. If we did it then, we can do it again. These are the lessons that should have been carried forward into the COVID pandemic too. But sadly, world leaders did not heed our warnings. We worked with you, NGIC, and called for the same successes of the HIV pandemic to be repeated. With COVID, we did not succeed. A handful of companies were allowed to produce life-saving medicines to make $1,000 every second by selling them to rich countries while people died without access in the global south. And now we can see it happening again with Mpox. But enough is enough. We need to break this cycle of inequality and profiteering that costs us lives daily. Thankfully, we have the opportunity with the Pandemic Accord. Again, Prime Minister Gordon referred to it here. But that accord won't be successful unless it contains legally binding obligations to ensure that lives of people everywhere in the world are never again sacrificed for profits in the global north. Obligations to share health technologies like vaccines, PPE, diagnostics and treatments with low and middle income countries, but also to share the knowledge and technology needed to produce them, and to remove the intellectual property barriers that stand in the way. Mpox is a wake-up call. The next pandemic could come any day. To prepare for it, we need countries to share pathogens, and in return, they should have access to any vaccines, diagnostics, medicines, or financial benefit that comes as a result. When scientists in Botswana and South Africa first identified the COVID Omicron variant, they did the right thing. They notified the global community. And as a result, Moderna, Pfizer, and BioNTech were able to swiftly adapt their vaccines to the variant. But did Botswana and South Africa get those vaccines? No. Instead, they were punished with travel sanctions. That's an injustice. And the Pandemic Accord must make it right. We at UNAIDS are ready to continue working with you, NGIC, to use your voice, we'll support you, use your credibility, your experience, your leverage to push for a pandemics accord that addresses these issues. A moment in which we finally learn the lessons of AIDS, of COVID, and other health crises, a moment in which we rebuild our global health system on a binding commitment to approach every crisis with equity and solidarity, with communities leading the way, and with shared decision-making for all countries. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much for this encouraging story. I would like now to turn to my first speaker, President Kolinda Grabar Kitarovic, President of Croatia, 2015 to 2020. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Good afternoon. And today I will be speaking from the perspective of the co-chair of GPMB, Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, which is an independent monitoring body co-convened by the World Health Organization and the World Bank in order to monitor preparedness for potential pandemics and health emergencies. So let me begin by highlighting the importance of the Summit of the Future and the timeliness of this discussion within this context. The summit mobilizes political attention and commitment at the highest levels. It takes a proactive approach to the problems faced by future generations rather than just a reactive approach. It takes a multi-sectoral, cross-cutting approach rather than discussing each issue one by one. And it is very realistic about the need for smart financing rather than simply more and more financing. When we talk about pandemics, unfortunately, most people have forgotten about the last pandemic, and many mechanisms that were established to deal with its consequences are being dismantled. However, the issue of a new pandemic is not a question of if. Unfortunately, it's a question of when. Pandemics are a rising threat that is uniquely well-suited to this multi-sectoral approach because they are more likely to happen when other factors, often unrelated to health, are also on the rise. Factors like climate change, the increasing movement of goods and people across the world, the spread of misinformation, or declining levels of trust in governments. To give you a more concrete example, let me borrow from a fellow board member, Dr. Matt Stone. New Zealand has been experiencing more and more floods due to changes in weather patterns, and these are creating damages to vital infrastructure like roads. Now, veterinarians cannot reach farms to vaccinate herds, which has resulted in the re-emergence of some diseases. But the story doesn't end there, because flooding also causes rodent populations to migrate towards the drier areas. Veterinarians have noticed a greater mortality rate among cattle and are concerned about leptospirosis or plague. So what happens next? Will the re-emerging disease spread to humans? We don't know, but understanding the complex ways in which these phenomena interact is absolutely critical for better pandemic preparedness. GPMB will release our new report on pandemic risks at the upcoming World Health Summit in Berlin, in which we will underline that inequity is another factor that has a strong impact on pandemics. And we stress equity versus equality. Because in order to reach equality, some countries, some communities need a lot more assistance than others. So we're not talking about equality at this point, but equity in terms of meeting their needs and then ultimately reaching that equality. In fact, our recent research shows very clearly that economic and social inequity are the worst kind of factors because they affect so many things related to disease. Some of those effects are fairly intuitive, such as access to clean water, to healthcare, or our ability to work from home when isolation measures are in place. And of course, our access to vaccines, diagnostics, or therapeutics. Others are more insidious and long-lasting, like increasing levels of mistrust in government authorities, declining access to education, or increasing feelings of alienation. And finally, let us not forget that pandemics themselves increase inequity. The key question is what do we do about this? How do we address inequity and other drivers of disease, such as climate change, weak health systems, or lack of access to technology? First and foremost, we need to rethink our approach to pandemic preparedness, understanding that our ability to prevent and prepare for pandemics depends on many sectors and stakeholders working together to understand our specific areas of vulnerability by region, by country, by community. Is it urbanization? Is it the way we practice farming? Warmer weather? Second, once we understand our specific vulnerabilities, we need financing, far more financing than we're putting into pandemic preparedness right now, but also much smarter financing, because we know financing is limited. Smart financing is targeted, for instance, to the greatest vulnerabilities, coherent and not fractured, and sustainable, not just dependent on ODA or overseas development assistance, but coming from domestic and private sources. These require risk assessments and regular monitoring of pandemic preparedness capacities so that we direct financing to the greatest needs. Smart financing is also financing that can address several issues at once, or in this context, several of the Sustainable Development Goals, which brings us back to the need for multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder collaboration. And finally, the third point, we need concerted, coherent political commitment to this problem. The risk of future pandemics is too important to leave up to only certain groups of countries, which is why the pandemic accord must be strong and adopted by all countries. The UN is another venue for multilateral action that has a key role to play in forging consensus on the future of pandemic preparedness. We have many opportunities ahead of us, such as the World Health Summit, the G20 in Brazil, the World Health Assembly, but also COP29, and other platforms where we can make the right connections in order to help future generations prepare for the immense challenges they will face, starting with this summit on the future. One of these challenges will be, without a doubt, how to better prevent, prepare, and respond to pandemics. I hope that we can ensure together that we have the political courage to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, President Kolinda. I would now like to go to President Boris Tadic. Please.
Thank you, Ismail. I would like to emphasize a few important facts when we are thinking about potential of new pandemics and the capability of the world nowadays to handle such a challenge in a proper way. Are we in a better conditions nowadays than during the last pandemic with the COVID? I think that our friend Tedros Ghebreyesus is doing great job, and he prepared the United Nations system institutions much better than we were prepared before last pandemic. But the geopolitical context is not better. And I cannot even imagine how the world is going to function in the context of the few wars, not only Ukraine and Israel, Hamas, but also Sudan and other conflicts. All in all, situation with a war can bring all of us in an extremely dangerous situation regarding new pandemics. We know that most vulnerable countries can increase spreading of the virus in very fast and very specific way. At the same time, we have to analyze which kind of groups are extremely vulnerable, which kind of countries are extremely vulnerable. In accordance with expectations, in 2050, more than 60% of the population is going to live in the urban area. Urban areas are not very helpful regarding fighting pandemics. And that is creating new challenges for all of us, and we have to think how to to manage that situation, specifically in urban area. Second, almost 20% of population at the end of this decade is not going to have adequate access to the clean water and clean sanitation, which is also one of the factors of increasing pandemic and spreading pandemics. Those two facts, in accordance with the geopolitical context in which we are living right now, are not very helpful regarding our capacities to fight new pandemics and to be more successful in the future, even though United Nations system is doing a lot of things, especially International Health Organization, but this is not always depend on United Nations system. Finally, I would like to underline the importance of a multilateral system. Without multilateralism, we cannot fight pandemics. And we cannot have a really good governance in that respect. I'm not sure that current situation where we have a division within the world regarding wars is going to be helpful regarding creating better multilateral system, United Nations system. Contrary, when we have such divisions within the world regarding war in Ukraine, Israel, Sudan, and other potential conflicts, I'm not sure that we are going to be able to create significant reforms in United Nations system. That is a key precondition in terms of creating better governance, which is going to be able to handle new challenges of the new potential pandemics. When we are assuming all those facts, when we are analyzing all those facts, can we be optimistic? I'm not sure, but I think this is the right time for action. This is really right time for action. Everything is, United Nations are very, very important, and this is a key factor in terms of multilateral capacities to fight pandemics. But maybe this is time for really international action, and to mention that somewhere in the media is to make a kind of media action and a political action to appeal on all political leaders to take into consideration the importance of United Nations nowadays in these critical moments. Specifically, we are facing with the problem of lack of trusting. Even some doctors in my region are not totally aware about the efficiency of vaccines. This is a very dangerous situation. If we have to talk about efficiency of vaccines right now, we are going back a few decades ago when not many people were aware about the impact of vaccines on our daily lives. And this is a specific moment we are living in. To be very frank with you, I don't know which kind of action we need also in that respect. But lack of trusting can be the main enemy of our capability to create efficient governance, global governance, fighting pandemic. I don't know about your countries, but would be very interested to hear whether you have a such situation. But I was totally shocked when my doctors, who has been trusting in vaccines a few years ago, were starting to talk with me about negative impact of vaccines nowadays. I was totally shocked, and I don't know, is that the global phenomena or only phenomena in my region? But I have to mention also such a problem. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Boris. I think misinformation, disinformation, and social media played a big role in the reactions all around the world dealing with issues of vaccines and other matters pertaining to that. My next speaker is Prime Minister Joseph Muscat of Malta. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ismail. So I think the presentation we had from Winnie is fantastic, and I have very few points to add from her perspective and her experience. I'd rather approach the subject from a fact that I find fascinating. The fact that during the pandemic, even market dynamics went bonkers. So while it is true that the poorer countries had more difficulty to get hold of the vaccines, money in itself did not solve the problems. I had quite a number of conversations with countries, mostly in the Caribbean, which are not in any, or were not in any particular bad economic shape, which had the money, but found it impossible to access the supply chain because they were too small for the big pharmaceutical companies to actually give them any attention, because they wouldn't supply them with 50,000, 100,000, and they actually offered to pay double, triple the price, and it would not lead anywhere. So to me, that's quite fascinating that this was not only an issue of inequality in terms of economic inequalities, as we normally associate the term inequality. It was also inequality in terms of access. So I would say that in my own country, where we're just under 1 million people, had we not been members of the European Union, it would have been useless for us to try to get hold of the vaccines. So for me, this is one huge takeaway from the last pandemic, that access is as important, and access inequality is as important as economic inequality. Which brings me to, the fact that I believe that supply chains might probably be the name of the game when we come to our preparedness for the next pandemic. We are assuming that the vaccines, the whatever would be needed for us to cure what will hit us is just a matter of time and research, and will be the result of a human creation. We are not thinking of the possibility that maybe some of that raw material or that resource might be geographically secluded. God forbid we are in a situation where the next cure will need the equivalent of what rare earth is for batteries in electric cars or elsewhere, which means that the supply is concentrated in a particular country, in a particular region. And I do think that the only solution to that is really and truly multilateralism. And it's more than a sort of speech, it's more a question that if there is the chance, I'd rather give up some of my time for Winnie to answer, whether the point of access inequality is being tackled in any way alongside economic inequality. Because at least I know personally of 3 prime ministers which told me the exact thing. No matter, the money was there, it was sitting there, we simply couldn't get the product.
Oh, thank you very much for this compelling view of access inequality as opposed to economic inequality. Let me now turn to my last speaker, Najat Mokhtar. Najat, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the issue of access and equity has been discussed largely in this audience. And I want to tackle another point before maybe before discussing the vaccine is also how we can prevent pandemic. And this, we need to build capacities to be able to detect early before talking about a vaccine. And so what is in there and what is out there, because pathogens are not only coming from animals, we are talking about climate change. It's everywhere. It's in the water, it's in the food, in the earth. So we need to develop these tools, and particularly in the South. When the COVID-19 hit us, we as a UN organization, we were drowned by requests to really urgently provide support in laboratories to be able to diagnose kids. So this is like a minimum thing to be given. So now this is what we are doing, is to build in this network of institutions, particularly in the global South and by region. Pathogens are not the same in Asia or in Latin America or Africa. We need to learn and talk to each other. So with WHO, with FAO, we are building this network of institutions and to build the capacity, first to be able to produce their own diagnostic tool, to be able to diagnose. Sustainability is a key. And then building this trust to be able to share. And here where the trust, the ethical aspects and the multilateralism comes into the picture, is to be able to openly share the information and share the data, particularly when new vectors hits us, how we can immediately respond to that. So that's one thing. And the second is being able as a UN organization to talk to each other and coordinate. And I think WHO has done really great job during the COVID-19 by coordinating as the crisis, what we call crisis management team. So we don't duplicate, we complement. Very important among each other. So we need this type of coordination as UN institution, but also as countries by region and globally. And also we need to sustain the capability of institutions to be able to do their own surveillance and monitoring. And of course, we cannot do this without financing. So transparency in financing is a must. We are not at the same level. The executive director of UNAIDS has mentioned this. Countries that they don't have anything, nothing and in terms of capacity to be able to detect, and some countries at some medium level and others are higher. So we need really to bring those institutions at the level that they can really do their monitoring and surveillance by their own. And I think leveraging on what has been done during COVID and also during the HIV AIDS crisis, we need to learn from this. And I agree that multilateralism is one aspect, but also building capacity in the global South is very important, and it's must. And we need countries to be independent and capable to do their own monitoring and surveillance, their own vaccines, developing their own tools. We cannot just wait, in the global South, so that technology comes from the North. It has to be both ways. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Najat. Thank you. Okay, colleagues, we now have a few minutes left for discussion. I would like just to perhaps add on behalf of President Byra and myself, who have both had the privilege of participating in the Lancet Commission in dealing with the last pandemic and the lessons learned there, that we have to recognize that we need global monitoring and early detection systems, and therefore we need testing, we need therapeutics, and we need vaccines. But in order to deploy these tools, we need also to have the early detection and following up. Now, one of the new developments that's emerging right now from the technology is that we can identify the presence of certain viruses through the analysis of wastewater in various communities. And that means that rather than having to go around and test individuals, we can highlight which districts and which places are at serious risk, and then we can deploy our limited resources and tools where they will have the maximum impact. Secondly, we have, I think, also been very, I don't want to use the word lucky, but fortuitous, should we say, that we now know that mRNA vaccines work quite well. That was developed in extremely fast pace, but people forget they had been working on it for 20 years. From the old SARS, they started working on the SARS, this is SARS-CoV variant 2. So the original SARS, they started working on mRNA vaccines. And I remember discussing with some scientists at the time, somebody telling me, but you know, this has never been done before, and besides this, Moderna company has never done a vaccine. And I said, yeah, but there's always a first time. You know, that's, research is like that. There's always a first time. And we were lucky. Now we're seeing applications of this technique also for fighting cancer and other things. But fundamentally, I think we're back to the issue that we need to have a global system where, and WHO is the body that has the capacity to monitor the global situation and to follow up on that with the individual countries. Yes, we need to find also ways of dealing with whether the COVAX or other techniques to ensure that the availability doesn't go only to those who can afford it and not to those who need it. But we have been, I think, learning these lessons, and I hope we can apply it. I see the number of people who wish to speak, and so I will start with President Zattlers and then come to Kerry and then to Csaba. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to remind everybody that we were acting during the COVID in absolute, not uncertain, but unknown times. We didn't know anything about COVID and what the COVID pandemics will end up and what is the best thing to fight it. I would remind you that about 300 vaccines were developed. Only 30, that is 1 of 10, were more or less effective. There was no problem with the science because the scientists got the money as much as they needed. Science worked in a fast way. The production capacities were low, but they were, you know, increased not so in a pretty short period of time. The biggest problem was supply chains, distribution, and then these companies who were distributed these vaccines through all over the world and collected the necessary raw materials for production. They had the biggest problem because a lot of necessary trans-border barriers, trade barriers and restrictions. I got acquainted with one of these persons, and he said that during this COVID, the number of barriers and restrictions were reduced by 5, 6, or even 10 times. It depends on the region. So we are talking about the vaccines and the lack of vaccines, but practically there was money, but we can't get, you know. But practically the supply chains was the biggest problem, and we have forgotten. We have to work not only on let's say, what the health organization is doing, that monitoring. We have to look at connections between the world global trade and the global trade to make it very fast supply chains and distribution chains. This is a message I wanted to sell you.
Thank you, President Atlas. Also, I may point out, Winnie, in the battles for dealing with AIDS, there was a major issue when I think Brazil, South Africa, and others were suing for the right to produce generics, and some of the companies were refusing, and the South won that legal battle. So the IPR to produce in the South as well should be made available in the cases of national emergency, and certainly pandemics would qualify. You have capacities in countries like India, Brazil, Egypt, Indonesia to produce generic medicines, not necessarily to invent, but certainly to produce it on a large scale and at a very low price. So I think that lesson has also got to be deployed so that availability is much wider than it is. Kerry, I think you have the next.
I just want to quickly respond to what Boris was saying. There is a lot of misinformation about vaccines, and believe me, I'm particularly familiar with some of the people who are spouting that. But there's a really simple solution to this, very, very simple. The tech companies are not self-regulating. So all we have to do, I mean, with me as the exception, everybody else is from a government background. All we have to do is have regulations on 4 companies. And that's going to solve that issue on Meta, Google, TikTok, and X. 4 companies. And then we stop this. So that's what I would say.
Important point, yes, very important. Disinformation, misinformation, and the availability of real information, I think is very important. Shaba, the floor.
Thank you, Ismail. I hope I can give you a small piece of good news. When we talk about prevention, this was the only good side of COVID, because before COVID, we had a kind of monitoring system which was called DAMA protocol, Detect, Analyze, Monitor, Act, to identify those pathogens that may jump from mostly animals to human beings, taking into consideration that we know less than 20% of the viruses out there. Just think about, we spend much, much more money on identifying asteroids that may or may not hit the world, the Earth, in 100 years' time from now. But we spent very, very little to analyze and detect and monitor those pathogens that may be very close to us, maybe 2 miles from here, and have the potential capacity in certain conditions to make the jump. Now, the good news from COVID was that the DAMA protocol in many countries, now it's more than 30 countries, is being financed by governments. So my plea and advice to all of us in all our countries, it does not require too much funds, but it requires a dedicated institution, a dedicated lab in each and every country, specialized to the local conditions, to follow the DAMA protocol, and this is the most efficient, most cost-efficient multilateral solution for prevention. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Shell, and then Melana, and then President Baira. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'll be very brief, but I do agree, of course, that it's necessary with the new global strategy for how to tackle new pandemics. I think it's so important that the WHO has a central role, and it should be strengthened in that regard. But I will also, as Kerry touched upon, emphasize the importance of information to the public opinion, and true information, not misinformation. Drawing on the experience of COVID, the COVID pandemic, for instance, from Norway, I think a reason why we succeeded to combat the pandemic rather well was that the government emphasized frequent and true information to the public opinion of the situation, and not left this information only to the medical experts, but the politicians themselves stood up and gave frequent information through press conferences. So all us Norwegians, we understood, I think, the seriousness of the situation. And therefore, people went and got the vaccines. We know from some other countries that this was not the case. Too many people didn't take the vaccines. They didn't acknowledge the seriousness of the situation. So it's good with funding, it's good with systems, healthcare institutions, but people have to get necessary and true information to be aware of the situation. So that is my point.
That's true. It's very, very important that people be informed of what is going on. I mean, I liken it sometimes to what's happening in places like California and Australia, and sometimes even in Greece, where you have these huge forest fires. People have to know what's happening, where it is, how it's spreading, so that they can react and get out of the way before they get burnt up, as happened to some villages in California. So the public communication in a timely fashion, you're absolutely right, is absolutely essential. But we need also the question of trust, which I think was raised before, and I'll come back to Winnie at the end so that she can wrap up all of this. Melana, you're next.
Thank you. And speaking of Norway, the Norwegian Prime Minister at the time was set off as a model for that kind of empathetic leadership and informative leadership. There were many examples of what she said at that time to children and to others in the broader population. So I think the political point is well taken. But I want to mention that the policies need to include an understanding of different constituencies and how they're impacted. Because with COVID, there was a truly disproportionate impact on women, poor women especially. And to today, we are still trying to catch up with the consequences, the negative consequences on development as a result of those impacts. So I think we've got to factor in, I know others have talked about those kinds of differences that need to be considered, but I really want to emphasize that. And Winnie, you have a lot of experience in this space.
Thank you. And you didn't mention politicians telling people to drink bleach, but
well, those are the wrong kinds of politicians, Ismail. Bleach was not the answer.
Yeah, no. Okay, I'm sorry. Next, President Vaira, you have the floor. Thank you.
I have 2 points. One about the politics and the information campaign for or against vaccines, and the dialogue between, on the one hand, governments and their citizens, and at the same time, a dialogue between decision makers and the scientists, who are the ones to inform us on what is happening and how. And from the experience that Ismail and I, we spent 2 years working with this COVID-19 committee, and we were supposed to produce a report at the end that would give a really well thought out and fact-based conclusion. And what happened is that basically a violent confrontation erupted between virologists, the people the most qualified, the ones who know the most about the virus. And we got sort of drawn into an argument between, was this virus the result of actually scientific manipulations, which included making certain viruses more pathogenic and the thing escaping from a lab. And the second aspect was it did it originate in China, or was it really American researchers who were responsible because they've been tinkering around with the DNA and the level of pathogenic influence of these things. So when scientists start, pulling each other's hair with different positions about what it is, it's obvious that the general public really gets confused and doesn't know whom to trust anymore. I think it's very important to continue to support researchers and to see that they, among themselves, can come to some sort of conclusion before you can expect the general public to follow them. About Prime Minister Muscat's point, I think, is a crucial one about the size. It's too facile, I think, to make constantly the contrast between the North and the South because they are not homogeneous entities. There are countries in the South that are very economically advanced and some in the North that, because of their size, are really handicapped in terms of access. Latvia happens to have a pharmaceutical industry, and it would have had the capacity to contribute to manufacturing accessible vaccines for the region. But the question here is the one of the patent rights of the companies that develop the vaccines. And I think that one of the conclusions was that if an arrangement was made that would respect, of course, the investment that companies have made into the research, which is extraordinarily costly, but once the thing is done, that they could farm out, as it were, and it was done in certain cases, to other manufacturers to make sure that it doesn't take months and months for countries that are ready to receive them, ready to pay for them, but the supply isn't there. So that the patent regulations also, I think, need to be thought about. And the centralization of the World Health Organization could paradoxically, I think, be the one that could see to manners in which the decentralization of distribution could be arranged without harming the innovation and the investment that the big pharma companies have done.
Thank you, President Vajra. Now, my last speaker before I turn the floor back to Winnie, and that is Marina Piskalova-Parker. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will be very brief too. I just want to bring in something what Milan has mentioned already, is how women suffered most significantly as a result of the pandemic. But I think considering, healthcare only from the medical perspective maybe is not enough. Maybe we need to look intersectionally and consider, for example, prevention of domestic violence as part of the public health approach. Because, as we know, in isolation, in the lockdown, the number of cases of domestic violence skyrocketed around the world. And at the same time, it's the issue of mental health, physical health. So maybe we can start looking at prevention of the pandemic, also looking broader as how we can handle the consequences as a, planning of public health mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you very much. An important point indeed. And also, we are increasingly, I think, now recognizing the importance of the mental health side, not just the physical health side, and also beginning to recognize it also as a public health challenge. With all of that, Winnie, it's all yours. Wrap up whichever way you feel.
Thank you very much. This has been a very rich discussion. Thank you. I want to bring it down to global rules. The point that Prime Minister Gordon Brown made here so eloquently, that we have a multilateral system with rules that are not fit for purpose. That's what we saw during COVID. That's what we see in many contexts of crises. If I can take the example of Moderna, Moderna was a startup and came up with this mRNA vaccine for COVID. Moderna, I wonder how many of you know who are the owners of Moderna. It's a small startup with one external investor in the company. Would you know who that is? Moderna had a $1 million investment by, guess who? Dolly Parton. Dolly Parton. So it was a private company, and the one investor was Dolly Parton with $1 million. But they came up with this vaccine having partnered with an American institution, the National Institutions of Health, headed by, at that time, Professor Tony Fauci. They had benefited from that knowledge and research to develop the mRNA sequence that then became the vaccine. NIH tried to get Moderna to allow their scientists to be listed as co-inventors of the vaccine, and Moderna resisted. But had that vaccine been owned by the public institution paid for by taxpayers that had invested in that research, we wouldn't have had that price gouging. We wouldn't have had the denial of a global distribution of the vaccine. We would have had the public interest protected. So the global rules are such that companies can create monopolies, can hike prices, and national laws are also aligned to the global intellectual property rules. That's why after COVID, we saw a series of laws coming up in the United States, in Europe, with governments now trying to take back control from companies on the question of life-saving medicines. What we are trying to say now is, well done, governments of the North. It's about time you took back control and regulated in the public interest. But do it for the whole world. Don't do it just for your country. So we are urging the governments of the North that are now protecting their own populations to come to the pandemic's negotiations, Pandemics Treaty Accord, and agree for the same to work, that the public interest, the right to health is protected before the right to maximize profits. This is key, and we want to work with you like we did during the pandemics, during the COVID TRIPS waiver negotiations, to work together to push for legal obligations in the Pandemics Treaty on this vital question. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Winnie. Thank you. I just would add three quick things on that. First, there was an issue, as President Vieira pointed out, about the origin of the COVID, the SARS-CoV-2. The question I suggested to our disagreeing partners, it didn't really make much difference what this particular case may have been in the Wuhan market or in the Wuhan Institute. We know this kind of gain-of-function research is going on around the world today, and it needs to be regulated. It needs to be looked at. You cannot have a group of people like those who did in Boston University, who added lethality to the infectability of viruses simply by a local committee in the universities reviewing it. And we said, no. I mean, this is too dangerous. There has to be some serious analysis on how this is done and whether it should not be done in anything under a P4 lab and things of that nature. Secondly, I think so that we can say whether or not it was or was not in the origin in Wuhan, we know this kind of dangerous research is being done right now, so we needed to have it regulated, as well as the general monitoring we're mentioning. Secondly, the question, again, we should take a page from the UNAIDS or the AIDS thing, where the countries actually went to court and they got the right to produce generics, even though the pharma companies in the north were not willing to give them the permission at the time. So what we call mandatory licensing becomes part of that. And I think that's something that could be done in a revived WTO with the support of WHO in a new pandemic agreement. And we hope that all the countries of the world will share in this common purpose of a new form of multilateralism, absolutely essential for handling public health in the future, and to project also the support to the basic community-based and primary health care facilities in all the countries of the world, because that is where the first contact always occurs. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for this very good and lively session. We now will be having our closing dinner later on at 8 o'clock tonight. We'll be going back to the hotel and then here. I was asked, no, it's not a gala black tie thing as far as I know. I mean, I'm sure it's not. Now, for those who, but we have special awards that will be given to deserving people tonight, so I hope you'll all be there. Let me just also add that as we bring this technical part of our program to a close, that we will be following up with there's a session with our colleagues of the COP29 presidency who will be coming here so the members of the committee that is working with the COP29 presidency on COP29, please stay. Other people are free to go as they see fit. And thank you each and every one, and please join me in thanking our panelists on this wonderful panel. It's pretty damn good. Exactly 1 hour.
Incredible. Incredible.
He's a good chairman.